Hi, this is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video, I'll be taking a look at Iroshizuku Ama-iro. I'll do a writing sample with Ama-iro on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes, ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll also take a look at some writing samples that I did on other types of paper. I'll compare Ama-iro to similar inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the water resistance test and chromatography. Writing with Ama-iro using a glass dip pen was very pleasant. It came off the nib very uniformly and just felt really nice. The swatch that I made using tweezers was very crisp, and you can see there's a range of shade from, I would call it about medium darkness to fairly light. The drip at the end of the swatch has a very faint halo of pink sheen. I'll begin writing with my Pilot Kakuno. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. You can see this nib is not very wet with this ink, or there's not a tremendous amount of ink being put down, but it on this Tomoe River paper, it just felt very pleasant. It's an extra fine nib, and you can feel a little bit of feedback, but it was really enjoyable to write with. Next, I'll be writing with my Kaweco Lilliput. It has a fine stainless steel nib. This nib is a little bit more wet, and on this paper it was very pleasant to write with. I'll get into it when I talk about the other papers, but not all the papers were quite as pleasant as this one with this fine nib. Next, I'll be writing with the Lamy logo. It has a stainless steel medium nib. Quite a bit more wetter than the first two, and I'm seeing a little bit of shading. You see it a little bit more here in the loop-de-loop. This is one of those inks that when you have a smooth nib like this Lamy medium, it tends to drag the ink to the end of your pen stroke. So here at the beginning, it's a little bit lighter than the end down here where the ink tended to pool up. And since I usually print, you don't see quite as much of that in my writing, though you do see a little bit of shading. And maybe if I wrote a little bit larger, these are fairly small grids. If you wrote a little larger, you would see a little bit more of this effect. Next, I'll be writing with a pen that is fairly new to me. I bought it secondhand off of eBay. It's a Parker Premier. It has a 18 karat medium nib. Now there's a little bit of a hard start there, and I'm going to try to write a little bit. It may just be that I need to dip this again because I dipped this earlier this morning. I did have to redip it, and one thing about dipping this pen in ink, you have to make sure you get the ink out of those grooves. Now, this nib on this paper was, I don't know, maybe a little bit too smooth for my taste, which is kind of odd because on some of the other papers that I wrote with, this nib felt kind of just a hint of chalkiness to it, which I really liked, but then the lamy was too smooth. Now on this, the lamy felt more of that like buttery smoothness. Could just be because I just dipped this and this is a bit wetter. So I don't know. When I get done with the rest of this writing sample, I may do one more go through with this nib and see how it feels. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot Metropolitan. It has a stainless steel CM nib. Now you can see this nib is a bit drier and the ink looks a bit lighter because you're getting more of this shade whenever you're not getting as much ink on the page, but it was really smooth. Sometimes this nib can feel dry depending on what ink you're using, but that was really nice. Next, I'll be writing with my Penlux Masterpiece Grande. It has a stainless steel broad nib. Lots of ink being put down. This broad nib is just really enjoyable to write with. I bought this with a broad nib thinking that at some point in the future I would have this custom ground into, another size, but I'm having second thoughts because this is just so nice. And finally, I'll be writing with my PenBBS 308. I've replaced the stock nib with a 1.5 stub nib. Really wet, very nice and velvety smooth. I better put that on both of these. Let's try the Parker one more time. Okay, I'm still seeing about the same amount of wetness, but this time, I don't know, maybe I was just paying closer attention. It was nice. Um, just a hint of chalky feedback. That's kind of what I prefer. Okay, while this dries, we can take a look at the other writing samples. Okay, when I did the writing sample on Rhodia paper, again, the dip pen felt really nice and the ink came off the nib really uniformly. The swatch was really nice. It just let go of the paper here at the very end, but overall pretty crisp. Not as much of a variation in the shading as I saw, let's see, on the Tomoe River paper. Maybe they're about the same. Some of the nibs felt a little dry on this paper. Not when I put the straight face here, that just means it's not unpleasant to use, but it's not something that just stands out as, wow, this is fun to write with. Some of these others, like the broader nibs with the smiley faces, there's an element of fun to the writing, something that, if I had these pens inked up with this ink, I would look forward to using them. The Parker Premier was my favorite out of all of these on this paper. Part of that might just be due to I prefer finer nibs, but the finer nibs weren't quite as pleasant on this paper. They felt a little dry. The Lamy was almost a little too smooth on this paper. The Kakuno was nice. I'm more of a fine nib person. The extra fine nibs are not something I use. anytime other than when I'm testing inks. But this one felt nicer than the Kaweco fine nib. On the copy paper, the broader nibs felt nice. Now you'll have to excuse my pen lux. You can tell the color of the ink is a bit off. There was some contamination from the previous ink, but the broader nibs felt nice. There may have been a little bit of spreading, but not much feathering. The Pilot Metropolitan just felt a little too dry on this paper. The Parker Premier felt nice. And the rest of the smaller nibs, even including the Lamy Medium, just felt a little dry and perhaps a little scratchy on this paper. When I started looking at similar inks from my collection, I came across 3 that were nearly indistinguishable from Ama-iro. In fact, as I was writing with Ama-iro, I thought, well, this might be a less saturated version of Konpeki, but it's actually the other way around. Konpeki appears to be a little less saturated than Ama-iro. That kind of surprised me. And Sailor Manyo Sumire, again, looks very similar to these 2 inks. When I did the chromatography for Ama-iro, I saw a little bit of true blue stick down at the bottom and some, I'm not sure exactly, would that be considered cyan? I don't know if it's going to show up accurately now that I think about it. These types of inks, the teals and turquoises, don't show up quite as accurately on my camera. The part that lifted has a little bit more green to it. So I thought, this may have a water resistant component. And when I did the water resistance test, I did the writing sample on a little piece of rhodia paper and then dipped it or submerged it in water for 10 minutes. And it kind of blows out quite a bit. That's probably, that might be this part up here that kind of spread out. And then you have a very legible blue component left behind. All right, on my Tomoe River writing sample, I was a little bit surprised that all writing samples felt very pleasant after the other 2 writing samples having some that felt a little dry. But, you know, Tomoe River, that's usually your best case scenario. That's your best opportunity for an ink to perform well. And they all felt very nice on this paper. Again, I was a little surprised that this was so close to Konpeki. I guess I haven't used Konpeki in a while, and I was just thinking that this was going to be a less saturated version of it. So out of the 2, I think I like this one better. I'm learning that I do like the more saturated inks, probably because I love my fine nibs. All right, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.